Hey there, everybody. People in the chat, can you hear me? Okay, that's good news. You guys can hear me. We have about 30 people in. I think it's about time to get started. Let me pop myself in there. Hey there. So we're going to talk about Google, the new Google tag and the settings for variables. So it's going to be a confusing topic. Hopefully we can clear some things up, but it's also, in my opinion, a very useful change that Google deployed, and something that's really useful to us in our daily practice, and hopefully also to you. Before I dive in, first of all, you don't need to make any screenshots or notes because you're going to get the full recording. So that's all taken care of. If you have any questions, please just ask them in the chat. My colleague Peter is also in the chat, and he'll be taking note of all the questions. And then at the end of the session, we'll handle those in the Q&A. A little bit about us. So we're data to value, and we enable data-driven marketing teams to thrive by taking away the technical heavy lifting. So what do? We collect, we transform, and we activate data. So the difference between us and a lot of other agencies is we don't do the analysis part. So we really make sure that marketers are able to trust the data they use and able to optimize based on that. And we take care of the technical heavy lifting in the background. We've been doing that since 2019. We do that remote and asynchronously, and we work with clients from all over the world. And we try to focus on technical projects that challenge us and that help clients advance. So that's enough about us. Let's dive into the topic that you all came here for. So the Google tag. What is it? Because it is confusing, right? What is a Google tag? We have a lot of Google products, but what exactly is a Google tag? That's the main question that I got from clients. And that's the first thing we need to clear up. So if you go into your Google Tag Manager, and I think by now all accounts are probably updated and have this new feature. When you add a new tag, you can choose the tag type. And the tag type could be a Google tag, as you see highlighted here. And when you go into that tag type, you will get this interface. And it looks a lot like the Google Analytics 4 config tag. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's a tag ID. And the tag ID is an identifier that you put on your page to load a given Google tag. Now you can find these tag IDs for instance, in Google Tag Manager. If you go to your highest level page, so your overview of all accounts, and then you switch to the Google Tags tab, there you will see per account the tag IDs. So in this case, for this dummy account I created, you'll see that there are two tag IDs. One is G-something, and the other one is GT-something. The GT stands for Google tag. There can also be an AW-something, which stands for Google Ads. So those are Google Ads tags. And then the G-something, that is your Google Analytics 4 measurement ID. So the best way to think about this is the Google tag has the ability to both send data to Google Analytics 4, to your Google Analytics 4 measurement ID, and to your AdWords ID. In this case, I don't have one here, but I could if I have synced my AdWords account to this dummy account. So if you fill the Google tag out, you could leverage both of those. If you could also fill out the tag ID with only your Google Analytics 4 ID, measurement ID. In that case, you can't use the features here or here in case there are features here. So that's the way to think about it. Like the Google tag is sort of a mini tag manager within, right? Yeah, that's the way I visualize it. So diving back into the interface, you could fill out a tag ID here. So in this case, I filled out the Google tag ID. And the next thing you'll notice is there is a configuration settings section, which also looks a lot like what you were used to in Google Analytics Sphere in the config tag. So these configuration settings basically apply to whenever the tag is loaded, whenever the JavaScript is initiated, these parameters will be set. There's a bunch of default settings, and you could override them by specifying that in here. Right, so this is basically the way you are instructing the script to load in this case. So you could do a bunch of configurations in here. I have one, for example, in here right now. We'll dive into those later. And then the second piece of the tag is the shared event settings. And this also kind of resembles what you could do in the config tag. So you could send event parameters along with your config tag, which would make them apply to all events that follow this config tag. And I think this is an issue that a lot of novices have when they try to implement GA4. They try to put their parameters that they wanted to use, for instance, as a custom dimension in GA4, and try to put them in the GA4 config tag because that seemed like a logical thing to do, right? To list them all there and then make sure that you could use them as a custom dimension in GA4. And that's also a little bit what we used to do with Universal Analytics in the settings variable for Universal Analytics, where we would have one list on the configuration level and we could apply that to all events. However, that's not how this works, right? If the only way you could make it work like that is if you would refire the config tag for every separate event where you want to update these values. So setting event values on the config level, or on the Google tag level in this case, only makes sense if it applies to your entire website. So in this case, let's say you only sell in euros, you could set the currency in euros on this level, and that could save you the effort of passing along the currency parameter with the separate event tags that you're going to fire later, right? So that could be an example of this. In most cases, it's not a best practice to use this because it's probably better to handle it at the event level. But that's the basic setup. Now, looking at the UI, there's something interesting going on. If you notice here, I have the allow Google signals, and you see the check mark. And the check mark here basically indicates that this is a Google predefined field. And whenever you fill something out, you'll notice that that gets applied or not. So here I filled out something and it's not there. So I think that's a very welcome addition that makes it easier to double check if you're doing things right. Another welcome addition to the interface is whenever you start typing in these fields, you see a list of the parameters that are available. So that's also, in my opinion, a very welcome addition because it reduces the risk of typos. So that's also good to have. So that's it a little bit from the tag point of view. I think one thing to mention, going back to the tag level, is that it is an update in your Google Tag Manager account, and it has been forcefully updated, right? So if you maybe recently logged into your Google Tag Manager, you probably have found this tag in there suddenly without you changing anything. it does not change any of the functionality, right? So everything you had set up in previously with your GA4 config tag will be migrated, but it will function exactly the same way. So it's more of a change of how we can do things, but not necessarily a change of how you should do things right now. So diving into what is, in my opinion, the really valuable part of this, which are the variables. So we're starting with the configuration variable here. So the configuration variable is simply a list of key value pairs, right? So you can create a configuration variable, a variable type with, in this case, Google tag configuration settings. Give it a nice name. Don't be like me. Don't call it untitled variable. And here you could define whatever parameters you want to define. So in this case, I've set the adds data redaction value to true, which basically tells the Google script to redact the adds parameters in the URL before passing them along. So this is a privacy feature, right? So let's say I want to take privacy really seriously. I could do this, right? So these are all the privacy-related parameters that are in the table, in the list, basically the ones that Google had defined, and I've hard-coded them all to true or false. And by doing it this way, I could add this to whatever Google config tag I want to create, and I would only have to edit or update this variable, right? So that saves me time in not having to do it manually per config tag. Hopefully you only have one config tag, right? But you get what I'm talking about. So this would be step one. But then what is more likely to happen is that you will have variables in here based on, for instance, the consent state of the user, right? So for all these privacy related variables, you would set them to either true or false based on the consent that the user has given, right? And this really starts to make life easier for you to manage this implementation, to have this all in one place and have this all in one place where you need to update this and when you need to check this. Now, another really valuable feature is if you have applied this configurations variable that we just created and you selected it here in the Google config, in the Google tag, you have this button that says show inherited parameters. And once you click that, you actually see all the parameters that you have created in this tag and how they are configured in here. So that makes life really easy when you're trying to figure something out, looking into the Google tag, trying to figure out what is firing when. And this way you can actually see what variables are having an impact on this tag. So another great feature. So I really think the Google tag manager team did a great job on the user interface for all of this. And you'll notice this little icon over here. So you can even override an inherited parameter within this specific tag, right? So you have your logic in your variable over here, but you could decide to override it within this specific tag. So I could set it to true. And if I want to revert it, I can click this icon and then it goes back to what it is within this settings variable. So that's the main functionality of the configuration variable. Now let's look at the events variable, which is basically the same. Besides that it has this specific addition for Google Analytics user properties. But yeah, it functions in exactly the same way, but this is focused at the event level. So which can be tied to event tags and not at the configuration level. And probably you're going to use these the most, right? Because the configuration, you probably set that up once, but then the event settings, you're probably going to have more events than one, right? The user properties are basically things that are tied to Google Analytics user. So it's dedicated to Google Analytics in this case. So, we mentioned you could also use the Google tag for Google Ads. You could also use the user properties in here. Which makes life a little bit easier on you. But that's the way you would set this up. But now I think the most important question is why? How will this help me, right? So I want to walk you through a example to hopefully illustrate why I think this is helpful and how we use this. So this is a hypothetical old situation, right? Where we had multiple events. In this case, it's only 3, right? But you can imagine that there's something amazing, something cool, something even cooler, right? There's all these separate events for form submits, for clicks, for the whole e-commerce funnel, whatever you decided to create. And for each of these events, you would specify the parameters that you would want to see in Google Analytics or in BigQuery as custom dimensions, right? So when setting up, it's already time consuming to do this manually for each event because probably a lot of them will have overlap. They will use the same parameters. You could, of course, create a tag and then copy that, but then, it's quite laborious to keep doing this, right? So, but for each of them, you would be adding parameter 1, parameter 2, and map that to, in this case, the event is page view, parameter 1 is something, parameter 2 is something else. And then the next data layer push for the event something cool, the event name something cool, parameter 1, 3, and 4 map to this, right? So this is how you would set up your event structure in GTM. And it works, right? But it's quite laborious. And especially if you or the client decides, okay, we need to add parameter number 9, and it needs to be added to all tags. Now, in this case, it's 3 tags, but there are, of course, accounts with 20 or even more tags, right? So that's quite a hassle to update and to keep it well functioning. So what you could do with this new setup is we could create an event. We call it the generic event tag, and we fill the event name dynamically with the event variable. And we create a Google tag event settings variable where we list out all the parameters and we fill them with the data layer values from these parameters, right? So we just showcase the data layer pushes with all these parameters and these get filled out here. And in the generic event tag, we select this. So instead of manually adding these one by one per event, right? We have basically this settings variable. We add this. And then the last thing we need to do in this case, we need to limit the trigger for the event. So in this case, I use regex. There's other ways to do it, right? But in this case, basically I say only fire this tag on the page view event, the something cool event, and the something amazing event, like I just showcased in the previous slide. And then the data layer values, right? They are just data layer variables. So they're basically listening to what gets pushed into the data layer. Now, I hear you thinking sometimes you don't want the previously pushed information from a earlier action to be tagged along. So that would happen in the normal, in the data layer version 2. But you could also use Simon Hava's data layer picker to specifically only pick what gets pushed in that specific event push. If you want to know more about that, you should read this article. But this is the main point that caused the tag to fire, for which the variable is evaluated, right? So what happened? We went from this situation to this situation, right? So we're basically consolidating a whole bunch of logic into way less tags, right? And if this could even be 20 tags into one, right? Now, I don't think you should over consolidate because there is value probably to splitting things up a bit. So what we tend to do right now is we consolidate the e-commerce events, we consolidate funnel events, the page content related stuff, the user interactions, depending on how large the container is, right? But this consolidation will really help you with maintenance, with making sure that there's less human error because there's less copy pasting going on. So I think it's a really welcome addition to the workflow of how you can structure Tag Manager. So improvements are less tags, which also means smaller container size. So especially if you or your client has desires to have a faster loading GTM, right? That could be interesting. It's easier to maintain, easier to update, and in my opinion, also easier to understand because you can work from one container or from one tag or from a couple of tags instead of loading a million of them. So what parameters are we talking about exactly? So you might have seen me post about this. This is the documentation by Google, where it lists the valid parameters for configuration settings and for event settings. But the problem is this table is cut off. So it's, first of all, it's hard to read. And also it's not complete. If you compare it to what Google Tag Manager shows you, if you start typing in those fields, there's actually more of them than are listed in here. So I decided to make a Notion page, which I'm gonna live showcase, so bear with me here. So you should be seeing the Notion page right now. So what I did is basically I dropped everything that I found on the Google pages, so these two, and I dropped it in here. But I also added the ones that are not in there, and then I classified them. So you can group things per tool, or for instance, I labeled a bunch of them as privacy-related parameters. But there's also the unlisted parameters. So here you can actually see which ones are, you can find these in the Google tag if you start typing, but they're not in the Google documentation. I think some of them are deprecated or like universal analytics related, or in this case, these are app related. These seem to be AdWords phone conversion related. But I'm not 100% sure about these, so I might try to figure this out. And if people have input on these, feel free to message me. But yeah, these are also in there, and they probably also do something. But yeah, probably this is what you'll use the most, right? And I think a bunch of them, you should probably take control over them. So the privacy ones are, especially if you're operating in Europe, they're a no-brainer, right? So by default, the conversion linker will be set to true, right? So if you use the Google tag and you have a Google Ads account connected, then the conversion linker, which basically activates the conversion linker for ads and floodlights, is by default set to true. So if you don't specify it, it will be set to true. Same goes for Google Signals, for ads data redaction, for allow ads personalization. Right, so I think all of these things are probably worth it to take control over and set to default false, or at least make sure that they tightly integrate with your consent settings. So yeah, we'll link to this if you haven't seen it already. But yeah, you could just link this. You could copy it to your own Notion. That should work. So diving back into the presentation here. So far, I'm pretty positive, right? What are the downsides? I must say, up until now, I don't really see a lot of downsides yet. So maybe we'll get there, right? So let's speculate a little bit about the future downsides. The thing I'm most worried about is Google is consolidating this, and they're also they're also consolidating what we or how hard it is for us to control this. And that's basically the part that worries me because I think from their end it makes sense to streamline all of this and connect all these products together, right? But if you have a client that does want Google Analytics and doesn't want Google Ads, it becomes increasingly more difficult to deactivate this behavior. By default, it will be activated. That's a little bit the thing that I'm noticing. And um, more and more, we're seeing these things grow together, right? The Google tag, one tag to rule them all, right? And I think for a lot of novice users, this might, well, it will feel easy or easier, less confusing. But actually, the complexity is being abstracted away from them. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, especially if you want to take privacy into account, right? So I think that's the main potential issue I see for the future. If you don't take this seriously, if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know how to deactivate certain features, I can see a lot of websites just activating this and having a bunch of stuff activated that they probably don't want to or might not even use, but they are enriching Google's data set on with their visitors' data. So that's, I think, the biggest potential issue I see. I think probably we're going to see other tags also move into this, right? So I could see the floodlight tags play a role in this. I think perhaps other Google products, right? So it does have a lot of potential as long as Google allows us to manually override these settings. I think we should be good, but I think that's something we should try to give feedback to Google about to make sure that they do that. One of the things that really scares me is this menu. So if you go into Google Analytics, into the admin settings, to the data stream, and then to the specific data stream, and then one click deeper, I think there's this Google tag menu. So it's a little bit hidden. But this specifically reflects to the Google tag. And if you click around here, what it signals to me is I think Google is envisioning a future where you could have one Google tag implemented everywhere, and then in this admin interface, you could decide which Google Ads account you want to link with which Google tag, but you could also switch them out, right? So it's a little bit like a mini tag manager, kind of with these kind of features. But there's also this user-provided data capabilities where there's like basically a scraping functionality which could be set to on. Currently, when today my colleague Peter did a test, and currently whatever you have defined here, if you have defined something else in Google Tag Manager in the Google tag, that prevails, so that overrides what is defined here. But yeah, this menu kind of scares me for the future. If overzealous marketer at a client would go wild on this menu, we wouldn't know, and then what would happen. So that's probably the thing that's most worrisome to me. But yeah, so far for the speculation about this topic. So I want to dive into the Q&A with you guys. So you could ask questions. I think Peter, you can also unmute yourself and jump in. I don't know if there were already any questions in the chat beforehand.
Hello, hello. Yes, there were quite a few questions in the chat, so maybe we can just answer them now. So I think like first question was from Anders, and the question was like the only the parameters that get filled will be passed, given that different events need some of the settings parameters, and then there was also clarification. So if you consolidate events into one tag, you might want a subset of the settings parameters, leaving some of them unfilled because there are no data layer parameters to read. So I think like if you have like that setup that Rick was describing, that you will have several GA4 events consolidated into one tag, and then might happen that in the event variable or even parameter variable, some of the parameters won't have any value, so the value will be undefined. Then that value won't be sent in that event. So I think like if that value is not available, it's like you wouldn't even include that parameter in the first place. So I think that's nice, right? Like so you can just put them there. If they are not available, they won't be sent. So there shouldn't be any problem with that. Then we have another question. The Google Ads event tags will still be separated, right? But it can take the event parameters from the Google tag event variables. So yeah, I think like you can use the Google tag like so. When I'm thinking about Google tag, I'm thinking about like if you were working with GTag, you had that GTag config or how it's called, like right, like you could put Google Analytics 4 ID there or Google Ads ID there. So you can do that now, like in Google tag via GTM, right? And then you can use also like those parameters that exactly that event parameter variable to pass different configuration settings to that or custom data, right? Like to your Google Ads remarketing tag. So yeah, but I think like the Google Ads conversion tags are still there available and will be. There's another one from Ricardo. So if I have, for example, a content group parameter that is enhanced with the page categories of my site and therefore should be triggered at the page view event, where do you recommend entering this parameter if the page view starts with a Google tag and not with specific event tag in the variable configuration? Yeah, I think like something like content group or something that is not really changing in between events on the page, like more static values, you could put that in the Google tag, right? Like in the event parameter section, because that will be set when that Google tag is fired, right? And the page category is a good candidate for that. Obviously, it depends if you have a single page application, then it will get a little bit more trickier because you will just fire Google tag once and then it will persist the configuration. But if you're talking standard website, I think like you could put that into the Google tag, as that information might be useful for other events than page views as well. Like you can have content group as part of different interactions, so you can group other interactions, not only page views, based on that value. But I think like if you would put that into event variable and append it to every single event, that would work as well, just fine.
I think regarding the Google Ads event tags and whether they will be separated, I think right now you can use the Google tag as like a remarketing tag, so as a conversion linker. But indeed, for like the specific, what are they called? Conversions in Google Ads. So for that, you would still need the Google tag. But I think you don't need to separately implement the conversion linker and the Google Ads remarketing tag if you have a Google tag where you have the right AdWords account linked to it underneath that Google tag. Then it replaces, I think, the conversion linker and the remarketing tag, and all you need to do is add the conversions as separate Google Ads events.
Yes. So there's like Google tag also takes care of that conversion linker, right? Like as a parameter, then you don't really need to have that.
Yeah, that's
I
one of the
understand it
parameters
correctly.
you can configure, the conversion linker, true or false.
Yeah. All right. Sounds like it will load more JavaScript. Might be a con. Well, I think like there's like all of the settings that you do on the GA4 level property, right? Like that will be part of that GA4 library that is loaded, right? Like if you have like enhanced measurements, let's say, or internal traffic filter, that's all packed into that library, which is quite big already. So I think like this might increase it, but also like if it will be consolidated into one thing, might actually be a little bit smaller. Yeah, I'm not really sure like what the impact will be of that change. All right, there's another question. So GA4 automatically anonymizes the IP addresses seen hard-coded in your untitled variable settings, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So I put it in there in the slides, but actually I think the anonymized IP refers to universal analytics. So that's why I think Google didn't list it in the official documentation, but it is in there as a parameter you can set, because obviously currently there are still 360 clients who can still run universal analytics. But for GA4, it is by default anonymized, I think. Well, I'm not sure if it's by default anonymized, but at least the anonymized IP feature is not the way to do it. I think it's done in the interface.
Yes, I think so as well. I'm not sure. So, and there's another question. The GA4 user interface data streams, scary settings, where there are some default true, those needs to be deactivated today if applicable. Correct.
Yeah, I think a lot of those. So a lot of those only apply if you have Google Ads connected under your Google tag, right? So it says so in the description. So if you only have GA connected under your Google tag, or if you only use your GA4 measurement ID to do it, then they don't apply. But if you, what happens here? I get thumbs up. The AI. But if you do have Google Ads connected under your Google tag, then well, you don't need to deactivate them, right? Like if you have the proper privacy policy and you mention it to your users and so forth, then probably it should be fine. But if you want to be, rather safe than sorry, then I would probably deactivate them. Yes. And probably, I would deactivate them anyway, because maybe in the future somebody links a Google Ads account, you're not aware of it, and then it happens without you knowing it. So it's probably safer to set them to off and then manually set them to on. That would be my approach.
Yeah, or at least like review the settings there, right? Like nobody, like there's many people, they don't even know that there's that section of the UI.
Yeah, it's very well hidden.
If you don't override it on your collection level, like in Google Tag Manager, then those values will be applied, right? And there are some really weird settings, let's put it that way. Like sometimes like on the privacy concerning things, like grabbing the email address, I think, like scraping the website, stuff like that. So you want to at least review that, so you know what's set up there.
Yeah.
All right. There's one more question. What if I manage multiple websites using one unique container? Would we use one tag ID or two tag IDs, one per site? Yeah, I think like, so I think like it depends on whether those two sites are tracked to the same property, GA4 property. I think like if they are tracked into one property, then you can use one tag. So those those two websites will have shared tag with same configuration and settings. If there are tracked two different properties, then I would probably split it into two Google tags, because like you can have different settings for those, right? Like you can have like different features enabled, let's say. But if you, yeah, I think like that would be my approach at least, to split them.
Yeah, you could still so you mentioned you use one unique container, so you have one GTM across two websites. So you could still use like a lookup table for the tag ID in the tag. So let's say the tracking is identical, but you do want to track it into separate properties. Then you could have a lookup table that uses the host name to determine which Google tag ID to put in there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it depends on, you know, if it's separate websites, separate clients, then it's probably you wanna separate it. If it's like one company, one website, or you know, considered as one website, then probably you want to consolidate. I agree.
All right. Another question just landed. When consolidating events other than e-commerce events, do you recommend custom event triggers, or is there another rational way to make a trigger? The use of e-commerce custom event trigger using regex, like a customer journey for a lead. Yeah, I think like when you have a custom events, like custom data layer events, it's easier. Like if you have like what Rick said about consolidating those different types of events, I think like if you have a really solid data layer implementation and clear naming convention, then that implementation is much easier. If you need to do like a lot of hacking in GTM, like triggering tags on certain pages or after some form submits triggers, then it might get a little bit tricky to do that in one tag. Like you will have a lot of lookup tables and custom JavaScript logic that might get quite difficult to maintain and read. But if you have like solid data layer implementation and you maybe even design that data layer with this in mind, that you want to consolidate it in fewer tags, then I think that's the way to go. If you are doing a lot of hacking, I maybe wouldn't go that route because it might get really tricky. And then there's a question, even if you are benefiting, if you are adding a lot of additional JavaScript and lookup tables to the mix, if that even makes sense in the first place. So yeah.
Yeah, agreed. In the ideal situation, you want to have a clean data layer and base everything off of that. But of course, that's you know, it's not always possible. But I would definitely try to aim for that.
Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions before we close off? I think yeah, you need the developer indeed.
Yeah, make friends with developers. Like be friends with developers.
Always recommended. So I have a question for people in here who has already actively implemented it right now, or who is busy implementing it. Because it's of course relatively new. I will be sharing the Notion page link. I'll throw it into this chat, but also if you follow me, then you should also see it. So far, we can only create one settings and one events variable. I think you can create multiple. I think you can only tie one of them to one Google tag or one GA4 event tag or one Google tag, right? So you can't like consolidate multiple variables to one tag. Would maybe be a nice feature to overlay them somehow. But I think you can have multiple of those variables. So that's not the limitation. The limitation is how many you can use. Meanwhile, I'm collecting all the links to share with you guys here in the chat. So I'm going to send a bunch of links where you can follow Peter and me on LinkedIn and formerly Twitter, now known as X. Also, there's a link to our newsletter where you can subscribe. So we try to push out a newsletter, try to make it really high content. So it's going to be less frequent than we would want to. But we try to make it really valuable to you. So you can read the latest edition if you click on that link. That's a good way to keep in touch with us. And the Notion link is also in here. It's also on our social media accounts if you follow those, but it's also dropped in here. Last question, Jamie. So you could create multiple event variables and decide to which GA4 tag we want to add it. Got it. Yep, that's exactly true. So you could, for instance, create one that's specifically for the e-commerce tags, right? And one that is only for page view tags. Whatever way you want to chop it up. I think for smaller implementations, probably one covers all bases. But once it gets more complex, or once you want to separate things, then that might be the way to go. One additional question: if you have a GA4 config tag, several event tags, as well as an empty container, and it's all working now, any best practices for converting all over to the more consolidated G tag approach? Clean workspace. Maybe the approach that we did recently, Peter, where we basically tagged everything, threw it in a folder, and then created all new settings next to it.
Yeah. So I think it really depends on the implementation. If it's like, as I said already, like if it's really hacky, I call hacky implementation, like whatever. If you're using like the pre-built triggers, like non-custom events, like you don't have like proper data layer created, it might be really challenging to do that, like to consolidate it properly. But if the data layer is good, then I would suggest what Rick said, that you will try to consolidate it in different so you keep your original implementation intact, and then you will try to consolidate it through lookup tables and some of the regex logic and custom JavaScript, and you will just put it into a separate GA4 property first, just to make sure that you won't affect your ongoing tracking. If that implementation is not really the data layer implementation is not really good, then I would start there first, redo the data layer, have this goal in mind, and design the data layer in that way that we can handle that quite easily in Tag Manager afterwards.
Yep, agreed on that part. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email. It's Rick or Peter at data2value.nl. Thanks for attending, and hope to see you in a future webinar. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.